welcome everybody to our webinar today on social emotional learning. SEL is so important to everybody, and we are absolutely we're absolutely thrilled to be here. This is actually a repeat of a session we had done in February, and there's new news right now. So we are really excited about moving forward. I'd like to introduce the members of the panel here, left to right. I guess we did boys first on this slide. So Mark Zimmerman is the CEO of the Social Express, and he's waving wildly. And Carrie Rogers-Whitehead, the CEO for Digital Respons-Ability, and Karen Allen, who is our National Education Coordinator at the Social Express. I'm going to ask you all in just a couple of moments to give a quick introduction to yourself. Today we've got two sponsors. One is Social Express, and the Social Express is been doing, boy, Mark, you've been doing social emotional learning since before people were used to using that phrase, right? So the Social Express as a core of 3 suites in the product for both teaching students, direct curriculum teaching students about social emotional standards, as well as diving into things like anti-bullying and career preparation and transition to the workforce. Our other sponsor is Digital Respons-Ability. And Digital Respons-Ability has been really engaged in doing professional development for years, starting out of Utah, but now growing across the country with their online solution to help teachers build their expertise in digital citizenship, learn how they can be leaders in that respect for everybody. So it's really interesting. This is a great time over. There's a lot of social emotional learning that we'll be hearing about that's part of the program as well. So thank you so much, Carrie, for being here and being a co-sponsor. So I already told you a little bit about everybody here, but let's start off. We can go in the same order that we were going before. Mark, if you want to kick us off and just say one fun fact that people might be surprised by.
Wow. Well, I would have to say the most fun fact is that I am a closet Barbara Streisand fan. I'm a heavy metal rocker, but I love her, and I listen to her with headphones so nobody knows what's going on.
You love Babs, huh?
Mm-hmm.
It's like butter. It's like butter.
It's like butter.
Like butter. Carrie, what is one fun fact that people may not know about you?
I am a big horror fiction reader. I read everything, lots of authors, but I'm the biggest wuss with the movie. Like, I've read It by Stephen King like 6 times, refused to see the movie. I've walked out of scary movies. I'm a big wuss when it comes to movies, but I'll read all the books.
Yeah, I'm with you on the movies part of that. I'm not a big fan of spending time watching people get cut up in lots of little pieces. Oh, and Karen, one fun fact that will surprise people about you.
My fun fact today, especially because I saw that there's a couple people here from Kenya, is that I have traveled almost around the world. I did that after my 7th year of teaching. I went and checked out as many places as I possibly could, including spending a lot of time in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America and other places. So, and I traveled for about 11 months and mostly by myself.
Wow.
So that is my fun fact for today.
That is a fun fact. I've done some solo trips. It's really quite different, right? You really, you meet a lot of people that you never thought you would meet on your own. So
that's right.
All right, we'll start with our first little baby poll to everybody and just ask them what's their role in education. So we've got a few different categories here. This is your warm up. Don't pass over this chance to make sure you know where to click, because we've got a few more for you as we go along. And administrator, general ed, special ed, technology director, or other, and we'll put it in the chat and let's see. We've got school psychologists. I see a few of those. Preschool, after school, aftercare director, They're going by so fast. It's really hard to catch them all. Anything unique catching your eyes, folks? We've got
Family advocate.
family advocate. I like
Media
school
health ed
counselor.
teacher.
Mhm. Sexual violence prevention educator. Yay. Awesome. See, there will be more and more roles like that as we're coming on through. But I think we had a bulk of folks in a lot of different areas. So we're going to try and remember how we can get to that and see where the polls are. Okay, so there was 39% were other, 37% were teachers in general ed, and then the next big category was 16% in special ed. So nice little mix there. Awesome. All right, so today what we're going to do is try and go through what our experiences have been around social emotional learning, talking about this whole skyrocketing demand for supporting students and teachers in terms of their social emotional health and well-being. And of course, coming out of the pandemic, what do we need to be paying attention to? We'll be addressing that as well. I think that the new funding that had come out from the government for the American Rescue Plan, elementary and secondary school emergency relief, all of that new funding is the first time we've ever seen, the four of us were talking about it, it's the first time we've ever seen social, emotional, mental health, wellness put on the same level with academics in terms of funding, right? We've seen a whole bunch of different types of funding things come out over the years. This is probably the first for this. So what we thought we would do is we've got several big topics to talk about, and we're going to toss it on out to you all first. So let's do the first one. What are you hearing about social emotional learning in your state? Is it a priority? Is it not a priority? It's just not even being discussed quite yet. Is it being politically bantered about? Not going to happen. Like, no, that's just not even going to deal with it here, or anything else you can add on into the chat. So we're going to let that kind of roll for a second or two and see what we've got. We've got almost 600 people attending right now. So just taking a look at about 200 responses yet. So looking to see what people are talking about. I see huge priority in New York City. Yes, ma'am. And I see lots of folks talking about important, but not a priority. Interesting. And that's one of our international friends even saying, so it's very interesting in terms of how that will flow within the world. Okay, so about 82% and growing saying a priority, and about 10% non-priority, and a little bit going from there. So that having been said, let's close that poll, and now let's turn that question on over. Turn that question back on over to the team here. What is the biggest challenge in regards to social emotional learning right now? What might be some of the misconceptions, and what do you feel about the priority versus non-priority type of a thing? Anybody want to start? Carrie?
Well, I felt Mark should start because he's been working in this area a lot longer. But I mean, I can certainly say there's some misconceptions, and we were having a conversation about this preparing for this panel about a lot of the things that we're seeing in like the media and the outside world, a lot of these misconceptions that we were talking about. I was a bit confused, and Karen and Mark told me some of the inside scoop of that. So I was going to defer to Mark.
First of all, it's wonderful to hear that predominantly people are concerned about this topic at their state. But I think some of the biggest challenges that are going to be happening for those that are prioritizing it, as well as trying to get it prioritized, is really just assessing the needs of our kiddos. And it's not going to be something that we can say this is the pandemic has affected everyone the same, and I think that we really need to do a good job of looking at our kiddos in the fall for not just learning loss, but also what are we seeing from the trauma that has presented itself from COVID. So I think that the challenge for schools is going to be what and how to implement the fixes that these kiddos are going to need.
Absolutely.
And from my standpoint, I agree with of course everything that's been said, but I also think that one of the areas that we could get into some struggle is if we separate SEL from academics. If we make it where the academic trying to make sure that we have filled in everything that has been missing over this past year of COVID, and we don't pay attention to the fact that social emotional learning has to be accessed in order for that academic success to happen. So social emotional learning, as I'm sure everybody knows here, has to be the foundation in order for students to be able to access academics. And the other piece of it is really around equity, which is that if we don't pay attention to social emotional learning being at the foundation of what we do, we're really going to miss out on an opportunity to make sure that we're hitting equity really as a highlight and a centerpiece to returning back to school. We know that students come from all different households, all different communities, all different neighborhoods, and that in itself creates a sense of inequity. So we can't depend on what's going on at home. We also know what's happened during the pandemic in terms of kids who have had more access or less access, and kids who have had more support and less support. So in order to create that strong foundation of equity, we need to make sure that social emotional learning is really at the forefront and is treated as a foundation to where we spring from.
Mm-hmm. So two interesting comments in the chat about this, guys. One person saying that teachers are feeling it's a waste of time, that they're too busy with academics. And maybe I could add on that, maybe they don't feel quite as prepared. But then somebody else talking about the fact that it really is getting to be prime time. Case in point, Naomi Osaka, who's the tennis player, just pulled out of the French Open because she was having some real anxiety issues around dealing with the press and the amount of pressure that the press put on them. And she just really couldn't deal with it. She said, you know what, it's not worth it. And she bowed out of the French Open, and that's got a bit controversial. And I think both sides of the coin there are what we're dealing with in schools. How do we address that?
Well, I think another important thing to address as well is that we put so much emphasis on the student needs, and we tend to forget about the teachers themselves. We've all been through all these problems, and it's not just the students that are going to need help. It's going to be the teachers themselves. So everyone's already walking into a situation where they're going to feel anxiety about being back at school, and there'll be a mixture of feeling great and also some nervousness about all of this. But I think we also need to address the teachers and make sure that they have the necessary support, because if the teachers are not in check, they're not going to be able to deliver any valuable education experience to the kiddos. I think that it's a shame that Osaka did drop out of the French Open, but she was mistreated kind of by the press at the US Open when she beat Serena back in the day. But that's here or there. That's a whole other topic, right? But I think as far as the time in the day is concerned, and Carrie, you can speak about this because of what you do. They find time in the day for what you do. So I think it's important that that teachers block out some time every day to do something for SEL. And if they can blend it, like Karen was saying, into their academics, that would be the triple home run there, right there, the grand slam. But Carrie, what are your thoughts about time in the day? That's something that they're all constricted by.
Yeah, well, and Mark, you were talking about the individual level, which is the teacher support. And I see SEL, some of the challenges, as a systemic thing. And we see this in other areas too. It's not written into the standards. There's not clear maybe assessments on what that is and what success looks like might not be the same for everyone else. That can be an issue in digital citizenship as we're trying to embed this in multiple places in the classroom. Sometimes you can only find standards in like media specialists or bits and tiny pieces here, but not really a holistic way. So those things that don't have clear standards or assessments just get lost because they're so busy. We do a ton of after school work because they don't have the same, like, they don't have to teach to the test and after school or in a library or with a nonprofit partner. So it's easier to sometimes embed that in a larger scale with an after school program than sometimes in a K through 12 classroom.
Well, I know that if the environments that are set up in the classroom are environments that are from ones that really pay attention to trauma, if it's a trauma-informed environment, if it's a restorative environment, using restorative practices as being the environment in which the students are very, very used to, in which the teachers are setting up as their common practice, as a way that the environment is going to be all the time, not just in a crisis moment. If a trauma-informed environment is set up from the very beginning of the school year, what it's going to mean is that all of those kids and adults alike who have not come straight out and said, I am dealing with this, this is my trauma, this is what I'm going through. If we set up those environments, we're not going to miss anyone. And it will mean that those people who are really hanging back in the shadows and not sharing, and I'm talking about adults especially, because kiddos tend to share a lot more. I mean, I was a high school teacher, and high school teenagers, you really get into an issue where they don't want to share as much. Younger kids, as we probably all know, share a lot more. But what I can say is that if we set up these environments in a proper way, if they are trauma-informed, if they have a foundation of social emotional learning, if they are restorative from their nature, then we will be able to see a lot of effectiveness in both the children and the adults in the room, because everyone will benefit from that type of environment.
Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing some folks saying, like one lady is saying that her school does it in the morning. That is so amazing. That's great. They've got already a cadence or a protocol there that in the morning they're going to start the day off with, something that about sharing, feeling, caring, etc. That's great, but it's really hard to do that across the board without, I would say, my 2 cents, without some professional development coming up ahead of time so they actually know how to do it, right? I mean, that's a big piece of it as well.
I think, just to kind of, I've been watching some of the chat stuff and seeing that people are discussing about how important it is for teachers to express themselves and what they went through. And I really believe, like, this is a time to be okay. It's okay to be vulnerable. Even though you're the leader and you're up there and you're teaching 30 kids, 20 kids, 40 kids, however many in your classroom, if you shed a tear in front of your kids about what happened and what somebody, it'll go a long way, because once you give the students that pathway to you, they feel comfortable. And maybe, Karen, even in high school, I don't know, if the high school kids will open up, but maybe, because once they see that, the teacher is like them and they're expressing their feelings, then I really think that will be a gateway to healing quick.
And I think what Mark is talking about, and Karen as well, is these norms. There's a generational difference a lot between expressing these feelings and talking about mental health. You have a divide between the teachers and the students, and they're just more used to it. It's a norm. And Karen's talking about this. Let's have a trauma-informed norm. Let's make this, we do this every morning. It's just what we do. And until the shifts in norms happen, which is partly a problem with systems, partly because of generations. We're not used to talking about these things. It's harder to make sometimes those shifts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions that kind of lead us toward our second poll. And before I actually start that, I'm going to tell you the question that sort of jump-started it in my mind here. So we've got a question here from a PhD student in Turkey who's saying, can we use mindfulness programs to support SEL? They would like to learn more about just and how it's being used in the classroom. So one of our poll questions that we wanted to ask everybody, and it actually is the next one that we were talking about, is what which one of the following is SEL?
Yeah.
So let's do a little test. How much do y'all know about social emotional learning? And let's talk about it. Is it yoga? Is it stopping, phys ed and doing yoga instead? Is it curriculum on behavior management, which could be things that BCBAs do or other types of behavioral modification programs? Is it meditation and the mindfulness and deep breathing? Is it curriculum focused on building emotional intelligence or something else? And you'll pop that on into the chat. Well, I think somebody stacked the deck here.
This is a smart group here.
So we're not being fooled by, just some deep breathing and yoga is going to make do, and that's going to be your mindfulness and your SEL for the year. I like some of the answers. Somebody just said it could be all. I like that.
Yeah.
That's, these could all be subsets of the one. All right, I'm going to stop the poll. We've got 88% talking about the curriculum focused on the total emotional intelligence. But let's go around and just kind of define some of the things that you mean by social emotional learning, and what are the elements of that? Who would like to start?
I can start if you like. I come at this from two different angles. One is a dad of twins with autism, where anyone that has autism or knows anybody with autism, the low-hanging fruit is their deficit with the inability, to relate to others. So I look at social emotional learning as foundational social skills. When someone says hello, you say hello back. When someone does something that you're upset by, you figure out a way to communicate your feelings without throwing a tizzy fit, right? So there's meltdowns. So I look at it from a parent perspective and how I work with my twin boys with it, and then I think about it from a school perspective when it comes to academic outcomes. And as a parent, I'm not concerned about the academic outcomes. I just want my kiddos to feel comfortable and fit into society. But as an educator, I look at social emotional learning as a conduit to better academic outcomes for everybody. Because once students have their emotions in check and they're able to do project-based learning and understand their peers and be respectful to everybody and their differences, then I believe it's a very good environment for learning, not just for the kid themselves, but their peers and the teachers that are teaching the class.
Great. When I look at it, I look at it as like a practice, like a lifelong practice and a skill, like as an action more than necessarily a noun, like a verb instead of a noun. And so I think sometimes with that confusion on the poll is like all of them, because those are maybe practices based on, it's not, you can't just talk about it, you have to practice it. And that's how I view it, as a very action-oriented type of concept.
And I think what's important is the way that the poll came out in recognizing that curriculum is such an important part of SEL. And SEL has come a long way. I've been an educator for over 25 years. And when I started as a high school French teacher, SEL was really something that was treated as separate. It was something that was really based around this concept of mindfulness, that, if you stopped the class in the middle of the class to have kids do some deep breathing, you were doing SEL. And I think it has come a really, really far way, where now what we're looking at is curriculum. And we're looking at social emotional learning programs that are curriculum, that have curriculum, that are curricularly based, that really focus on making SEL explicit. And in order to build that foundation, in order to have these environments that we're talking about that are so important, the kiddos have to practice. I mean, that's the one thing that we're going to learn in coming out of COVID, is that adults and kids alike, we are all out of practice. We spent over a year not socializing, not being in classrooms together, not being in environments where we really could practice what Mark was talking about earlier, just the way of greeting people appropriately, which is, it seems like a really simple concept, but when you don't practice it all the time, it really does go by the wayside. And with all of the isolation that happened during COVID, we're going to find that that is going to be people's comfort spot, is isolation. Where it used to be their comfort was being around others, their comfort is now going to be the isolation. And so with SEL being something that is a curricular program, when you have really, really great, rich curriculum around all of these concepts and these foundations like Carrie is talking about, that's where you really see SEL come alive. And that's where we can build a better foundation, is when we step away from those once a week, 15-minute, like we're going to have, and I think these things are great. You know, I mean, Coach Jessica comes in and she does mindfulness with the fourth graders, and she does it for 20 minutes every Thursday. I would never trade that in for the world. I mean, I love it that she comes in and does that with my son's class. However, what I'm hoping is that there is a curricular program where SEL is being highlighted all the time in a very structured way, in an explicit way, in a purposeful way, so that we can make sure that that highlight on curriculum is something that's followed, and we are really building that solid foundation.
So what I'm hearing you say, and everybody really kind of saying, but Karen, I think you're putting it in good respect, is that a curricular-based approach, which means systemic. It's not just one shot or one lesson or one mantra that's going to solve the whole thing, but that it's more of a systemic answer. As I've seen, there was one person who had a question here in the chat about what do you do if you have one student who is using spreading negative energy, and that's spreading to other students. And so I think that what we're talking about is the way to get ahead of that, right? Because we're not using SEL to sort of deal with acute behavior, like what's happening right now. If somebody's doing something right now in my class and it's not safe, or it's not polite, or it's not positive energy, you want to have a way to interact with that behavior. But you're talking about getting ahead of that to lay the groundwork for everybody to have some common language. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the difference between just going after a behavioral problem and then focusing in on something that's more systemic and lifelong, hopefully.
Absolutely. In fact, Joyce, what you're talking about in that comment in the chat is really about setting up a restorative environment and setting up the use of restorative circles, so that when there is a crisis moment, when something really goes wrong, that the class is coming together in a circle type format, and you're healing, and you're dealing with the harm, and you're healing the group, and you're bringing everyone back as a community. But what I'll say that is that if we don't have SEL at the foundation, those restorative practices and that restorative environment is very, very difficult to approach, because the kids, when they come into the circle, for example, they don't have the tools that they need to make the circle effective. So it's a real domino effect to me. I see everything being very interconnected in that way. But if we don't have the one, we can't really effectively have the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very true. And I think that's where you have that foundation, those foundational skills, restorative circles, and being able to help students at an acute time when there's actually something that's going on at that moment, versus being able to handle throughout. Anything to add to that? Anybody else?
Well, I think that, kids are going to act out. Behavioral issues will never go away. COVID, no COVID, you're still going to have a certain amount of kiddos that are going to have behavioral problems. But I think what you have to do is recognize that kid is seeking help and looking for help. And that's why they're acting in that way. And there's a couple ways that you can handle it. You can embarrass that kiddo and punish him in front of his peers, and that probably won't work. Or you can ask that student to politely just, express themselves or how they're feeling, let the kids listen, and then maybe pull that kid aside and have a private meeting and find out what's really going on with the student, because they don't want to be acting like that. They're exhibiting something because of their anxiety or something like that.
Right.
Peter in the chat, I just saw this chat as an interesting thing.
I just saw that too. I agree.
So Peter's saying that he's in a technical high school, and that they're basically saying toughen up. And that's a term that you hear a lot in different states, in different places where SEL may not be as important like it is here where I am in Karen, California. And So he's saying, how does it become a little less touchy-feely? Well, if you look at the Castle definition of SEL and the skills that they're working on, not everything is necessarily has to be considered touchy-feely. Conflict resolution, relationship management, responsible decision-making, things of that nature is not necessarily touchy-feely. I think we get a little hung up now and making this bridge between SEL and pronouns and all these other things that need to be incorporated into SEL, but there's lots to do to encourage kids to learn emotional intelligence without it being, say, quote unquote, touchy-feely.
And I think some of that is related to that generational divide of who were the administrators and how do they perceive this and how did they grow up with all of this, and then the kids. And there's a gender component to it as well. Feelings are girly, for lack of a better word. And so I think adults and all of us, this goes back to the professional learning that Karen and Mark were mentioning, like teachers need to kind of check and reflect and see how they're perceiving this, how they're talking about this, and how they're implementing this.
Yeah.
Language never changes, and language is something that will never change and has always been there. And the power of our language is something that will affect a kiddo for a very, very long time, and will have an effect on the classroom environment and on anything anywhere that person goes. And so as far as the toughen up strategy goes, language doesn't have to be touchy-feely, but language needs to be rooted in empathy. Because the one thing that we want all kids to know is, and everyone to know, I mean, adults like this too, is that we want to listen attentively. We don't always have to fix the problem. That is not why we're here. We are not here to fix the problem. We're not here to toughen kids up. We're here to actually listen. We're here to make sure that people know that if you express yourself in a way that makes sense, and if you express yourself in a way where you are managing yourself, people will listen. But as educators and as adults, we often think that it is our job to fix everything and to toughen kids up and to hug kids and do all of this. And really, our job is to make sure that kids feel heard and that they have the language that they need to be able to be listened to, and also to build this sense of empathy. Without empathy, really, we don't really get anywhere. Empathy makes it so that people want to repair harm. Empathy makes it so that we can all step in each other's shoes when we need to. And really, it is the foundation of the way that society works is, we want it to work that way in being empathetic. Right. So, I think that the language piece is really, really important.
You're so right, Karen. Go ahead.
I was going to say, too, as far as framing it, I think it's important that we understand SEL needs to be delivered to kids in elementary school different than it does to kids in middle school and different to kids in high school. So when we're dealing with kids in high school, when we're talking about SEL, to Peter's, how to frame it, maybe you talk about you're on the job and you've got somebody you have to work with. And how would you handle it? Put it into a way where it puts them in a situation that is relatable to them at their age. You don't want to talk about working at a job if you're in third grade and you're learning SEL. You want to learn about how to treat your classmates on the playground and how to take your turn. So SEL can't just be a one-size-fits-all for all ages. It's got to be delivered in a way that at that age it makes sense to them and they can relate to it, how they're going to benefit from this knowledge as they move on in the world.
Right. And so I've seen a lot of questions going on in the chat about, well, how and where and what type of curriculum and so forth. So I put one comment in there just to let everybody know that there is materials from both Digital Respons-Ability and the Social Express in terms of professional learning to help teachers get ahead of this, because I think that's step one, and now is the best time for that. But then also the Social Express has actual curriculum around the CASEL standards for students starting at kindergarten through high school, right? So we've got a number of different types of things. This particular EdWeb's not supposed to be a commercial, but at the end of it, we'll give you some places where you can go and ask for a personal tour, and people will, be there to help guide you through what some of that curriculum is like. I think it's important, though, to kind of differentiate between those little areas of practice that we mentioned before, like the yoga or the meditation, and an actual curriculum. And Karen, I think you've got a really good perspective on what makes up, don't you love my video? It's so great. What makes up what makes a curriculum, an SEL curriculum, different than just doing, deep breathing and or, saying a mantra or something.
Well, the exciting thing about curriculum is that curriculum works with academic achievement. So when you have a program that is curricularly based, what you're doing is you're paying attention to all of those elements to academic achievement that are so important to us as educators as well. So when you have curriculum, you've got not only the content, but you've got a way for the kids to practice that content. When you have really good curriculum, you've got ways to practice the content through learning activities and other means that are challenging the kids. So you've got critical thinking that's involved, you've got application that's involved, the 3 different steps to asking questions, those questions being literal, interpretive, and then applied. That is a sample of what a curriculum should be like. And so if you have curriculum that surrounds an SEL program, for those people who are concerned that SEL takes away from the academic building blocks from kids, once you have curriculum around SEL, where it isn't just a 15-minute mindfulness on Wednesdays, but you have a true curriculum that you're looking at, then you're actually approaching the academic success that we are looking for. The critical thinking skills, the communication skills, the group work, the way that all of that is integrated into SEL as a foundation, that's the way that you can really hit on making this a curricular type of program instead of making it something that is, first of all, separate from what you're doing, and secondly, not treated at the same level as an academic type of an academic type drive. Because really, academics is something that is very, very important within SEL. And you can't reach that academic success without SEL. It's talked about a lot when we talk about Common Core standards and the way that SEL goes hand in hand with English language arts standards and math standards. And a lot of that is really what it is that you can't reach those academic levels without that SEL. And if you don't have a curriculum around it, then you're not giving kids an opportunity to practice, and you're also not asking them to level up. Because all good curriculum levels up, whether you're in general education or special education. When you can give the kids the opportunity to do something that's a little bit more challenging and really challenges their brain, that's when they're learning. That's when they're practicing. That's when it's really getting embedded into the way that they walk through the classroom, through the school, through the world. And especially, like Mark said, in in working with high school aged youth, if you have a curricular program that is focused around SEL, you're going to reach those kids. And they might be older and you might think SEL is not for them. But if you have a very strong curricular program, then you will be able to have success with those older students as well.
Yeah, and while I appreciate the plug, and I'm so happy to be a sponsor here, I do want to acknowledge that this takes a village. There is not a silver bullet program that's going to be the catch-all for SEL. Whether you're using yoga, mindfulness, whatever you're doing, it's going to take a lot of different strategies to get through to all of the kids. And that's why I get so frustrated when there's just a one-size-fits-all for the entire district. It cannot be like that. We have to be aware that it's going to take a lot of different resources and a lot of different areas to get the kids in check.
Right. I think that's really a big piece of some of the things that we've been talking about, the language, empathy, and I see people on the chat even saying, well, I've got to teach a lesson. I can't be doing SEL all the time, and I need to have them understand that there's times to do it and times not to do it. So I think all of that is spot on. It kind of leads us to our next question, the audience, that we're going to flip it back at them. And that is, what type of professional learning have you been offered around social emotional learning? What has been presented to you? Is it none? Have you gotten things that are as specific as restorative practices or digital citizenship? Have you been told, well, go find out on EdWeb? It's guaranteed there are a lot of good things here on EdWeb. Or is it something else that you've been privy to that you want to share that's been in the chat? You can share with us there. So I'm seeing kind of a three-way tie there. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Not a lot on the digital citizenship, which is interesting because we may need to redefine that as well. Let's redefine that a bit. But it's
I did
also,
an EdWeb webinar earlier on that, like how to connect SEL and DigCit. If we're building skills and want to change digital behavior, you got to start with those foundational skills, as Karen put it.
mm-hmm. And I see some other pieces here in the chat, things that people looked at. All right, I'm going to close the poll and say it's almost, and restorative practices seems to have the most number of votes done here, which is great. But the one that kind of disturbed me is right on the heels of that is none. As you've been offered none. So, I'm glad to see restorative practices is at the top of that. But gosh, having no options available to you. Let's talk about professional learning and why that is such an integral part of it. And maybe Carrie, expand a little bit more about digital citizenship and what role that plays.
It goes into a practice. We're using the internet every day, so we shouldn't just do little SEL skills to build our digital literacy, our immediate, our critical thinking skills just once in a while. So we incorporate SEL in all of our digital citizenship curriculum there by adding it, embedding it. Areas like media literacy in particular are huge for SEL. So like others were saying, it definitely has that academic connection, but there is a bit of extra work involved in that, as some other people in the chat said, to integrate that in there. So our digital behaviors reflect our our real life behaviors. So SEL pertains to both digital and real life worlds.
True, very true. Let's talk a little more about professional learning. Karen, restorative practices had a great big hit in that. It's nice to see. Maybe you want to even explain a little bit about what you're seeing in the professional learning you're delivering on restorative practice.
Well, one of the things that I see as with the restorative practices trainings that I've been facilitating is that if you want to have a trauma-informed environment, if you want to have a social emotional learning environment that is, that's an environment that's grounded in SEL, restorative practices is truly a strategy in making sure that all of those components to those types of environments are treated and are hit in the right place. And so the other thing that I'm finding is that with the restorative practices, the audience members that have been coming, restorative practices does ensure that, pre-K all the way up through undergrad, all the way up through college is something that can be implemented, because a classroom environment that is rooted around restorative practices is something that can be very inclusive through any grade. So you can have restorative practices that would be appropriate for a kindergarten class. You can also have it where it'd be appropriate for a staff room. It can be appropriate for adults where you're setting up restorative practices. So I think the notion of restorative practices in where it's really made sense to a lot of people is that it can be set up anywhere. So it's not specific to certain places. We can set it up in all different types of environments, and we will always have the same outcome. Restorative practices is a way to build, rebuild, and make sure that we are respecting community. Restorative practices is all about not only preventing things from happening, but also repairing harm, and also making sure that we are paying huge respect to how important community is. That's why restorative practices, when there is a crisis moment, restorative circles is what is used, because a circle really emulates what a community should be. And when you have a centerpiece to that circle, that's actually supposed to represent the center of a community. And when you have a talking piece, that is supposed to represent indigenous cultures who came way before us, who always used something when they passed it around the circle to make sure that people had a chance to talk and make sure that people had a chance to be heard. So I think that the whole concept of restorative practices is really hitting home because there is so much involved. And someone just said that they've heard of restorative justice, and restorative justice actually came first. Restorative practices was born out of restorative justice. So just in like historical context, restorative justice was started in New Zealand. And when it came to, and that was in the 1990s, actually in 1994 is when it became very, very popular in New Zealand. It came here to the United States and actually went from restorative justice to becoming restorative practices. So restorative justice and restorative practices go very much hand in hand. But what happened was restorative justice was going so well, and we still have a lot of work to do around restorative justice, of course, but it was going so well with the whole concept of victims and offenders being able to come together that what was decided is, wow, this would be a great model in not just the justice system, but in our classrooms, in our workplaces. And we need to have this become a practice, not just a focus in the justice system.
Interesting point. That's a really interesting point. And I think those are those things that we're learning from each other because of different backgrounds that everybody has gone through, right? The one thing we now can all say, sadly, is that we have a shared experience, a shared traumatic experience with the pandemic. And that's really worldwide, that everybody has had their own view of it, and it's impacted everybody kind of differently, but we all know how badly it's impacted some folks. People who have lost members of their family, or people who have been, shut down and are in situations which are probably worse than having been, not infected. So there's lots of different issues around it. Having that common experience almost lends us to saying, well, let's find out how it went for you. I know how it went for me. How did it go for you? And what are you worried about? And what are we going to be doing next? And all of those unknowns that are out there. So, and it's interesting how it grew out of social justice, right? Which is just other trauma. So somebody else had some other sort of a traumatic experience happening pre-COVID, and we've learned from that and how we can apply it. Interesting. How does that impact professional learning overall that we should be talking with administrators about?
Well, I think that it needs to expand who's getting it. It might just have been special ed or working with youth in like custody or youth in care. They might have been getting some of this training and it hadn't necessarily filtered to the other grade levels. There's not a systemic practice among all different grade levels, although all kids to a certain extent are affected by these traumas, but they're not necessarily having educators in their life who know how to handle it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very, very much so. And I think that that's an interesting thing to kind of dig into, because I know that we've had some research that was done even on the Social Express that had basically said that when the intervention, social emotional learning intervention, was done for our tier 1 students, for the larger number of students, it really had a great impact. And yet when you did it for tier 2 or tier 3, trying to target into smaller groups had a little less impact. And so doing it cohesively for a whole campus, let's say, or for a district, or for whatever it might be, within an area, gives everybody the same language and gives them that ability to be able to, understand what we mean. If somebody said to you, well, I think we might need to do a restorative circle, everybody would know what that means. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone going on through. Okay, cool. Shall we go to our last question to the group here, to the audience? And this is, because it's starting to skyrocket, is this really on your radar rather? So what is your district doing? Is this something that, yes, we're going to be pulling, we're changing policies, we're going to be doing some very targeted interventions, we're doing the professional development, or boy, we're not really doing much of anything. So great. So we are in the right place. I think everybody's on the right mind here. We're looking at professional learning being one that's skyrocketing throughout. Totally makes sense from that perspective. So what are some of the things that we can be doing to help folks out here with the plan? I'm going to end the poll here because I think we've got a majority identified with professional learning. What are some things we can help folks out in terms of how can they find some resources or professional learning that will help them bring back information to their schools about what you could do next?
Who wants to go here? Carrie?
I'm just looking. I see multi-tiered systems of supports, MTSS, on there, which goes to that. Let's hit everyone, because this is something that's affecting the whole school and affecting the community. So one thing I would add is, we do a lot of work with parents, but involving a lot of the parents in some of these discussions is huge. And sometimes that's really hard, especially with at-risk populations and everything. But if this is a practice, the practice has to continue outside of the classroom.
And it can't be a mystery to those parents, right?
Yeah.
If
or they're going to do something
home,
weird and show up at the school board meeting angry or something,
Right.
They need to have explained to them what it is.
Right.
My son wanted me to use a talking stick. He asked me to hold on to this. We're going to have a discussion, and everybody in the family was talking at once. Right? That would be an interesting thing to see happen with that. So parental professional learning, right on, Carrie. That's awesome. Very big piece. Other thoughts, folks?
Yeah, I think that, in my experience in attending professional learning for the many years that I have, it's always been a challenge on what you do next, right? So you get all this information, you attend this amazing professional learning opportunity, and then it's very difficult to try to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this now? So I think that beyond just the professional learning is the implementation. And it is perhaps finding that professional learning where the facilitator is coming back 6 weeks later to talk about implementation. Perhaps it's a course where there are people being invited to attend multiple sessions so that there can be some time to do that implementation and to have strategies for implementation. Because professional learning is fantastic, but it's only as good as the implementation. And like Carrie said, it needs to become a practice. So professional learning, going from professional learning to changing practice and transforming environments and really taking a look at how are we going to use this? I mean, something that's really good and important, how are we really going to use this and implement it? And so we have to look at where are we going with it? Where are we taking this information, and how are we putting it into, how are we going from information to practice?
As a parent myself, my kid has done the Leader in Me program. And one thing I appreciated is they would send me tips. We got wellness bingo. We got worksheets on the languages that they're using. So they had language about like self-regulation and calming down. And I was able to use that same language at home, and like having the same language for my kid helped. Like, oh, this is what mom's talking about, right? So it's helpful.
I think that also we have to be somewhat sensitive and have some empathy for administrators as well. While we're so quick to criticize them because they don't want to implement something or they're closed-minded, we also have to understand what they're going through and they have so much responsibility on their heads right now. So one of the things I think that could be beneficial is finding providers that will maybe do some piloting of a program so an administrator doesn't have to go deep into their coffers yet and start paying for things. And if you can find some things that will allow a pilot for 60, 30 days, 45 days, that may go a long way with your administrator. When you go to ask, hey, I need some social emotional learning, and here are some of the companies that I've researched that we can pilot with. And then from there, you'll be able to figure out what's a fit for your classroom or your school. But I think going to administrators and just telling them we need to buy SEL is going to be very frustrating. And I think the best way to try to get through to them is, give them solutions of what you want to do as opposed to asking them for the solution.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big piece of it. I like the fact, what we're talking about in terms of being something that's a little bit more cohesive, where we've got an ability to share the language within your school, the greater school community, right? Within that includes parents, that includes administrators, that includes the teachers, and of course the students. Also looking at the time, so I'm going to wind some things up here. I saw language, I saw empathy, ongoing facilitation of best practices. So it's not just a one hit, kind of a thing. Oh, we did our training. We did our training on social emotional learning. We can check that off the list. It's done. It kind of is one of those things that may never be done, that where teachers may still need to kind of come back and regroup and say, I've been trying this, but it's not working for me. Anybody else? Love the ideas about parent training and about MTSS having something for everybody, and just understanding that this is probably one of the areas where there's not as many just clear-cut right or wrong answers. That sometimes you need to evaluate each situation and be able to come up with what worked for you all at the best time. When you're giving strategies out to kids and teachers, some people may get different strategies because it fits them better and for what they can do and what they can't do. So I just want to thank everybody who's here over at the socialexpress.com. There's information really K through 12, CASEL, SEL standards, anti-bullying, and career preparation, transition preparation. And then over at the Respons-Ability.net, digital responsibilities, professional learning programs, and education really support. And they do customize, right? You customize what you're doing with folks. We've got an online teacher course, which would be great for the summer for helping them get the basics of some of the digital citizenship and online safety. And my sincere thanks. We've got a couple of moments. Any one parting word that anybody wants to kind of say, here's the one thing to remember?
I would just say breathe. Make sure you're breathing. Get to school and breathe and think positive, and just be so excited that we're on the other side of the bell curve here, and we're going back in person, and we're going to get back to normality. I think we have a lot to be thankful for in many ways, and I think we need to just share that love and just make sure that kids are safe and happy, and everyone is, obviously. And thank you to all the teachers out there for all you've done this year and all you continue to do for our kiddos. You guys are amazing people. Absolutely.
Carrie?
Well, I remember going to a conference and hearing about the platinum rule, not the golden rule. Don't do what you would have done to you, but what they would want done to them. And that's that empathy piece. And we've been through a lot. We can all use a bit more empathy and think of the platinum rule about them, not necessarily how we would want things.
That's great. I like that. And Karen, any final thoughts, words?
Well, as you move forward and as you are, continuing to branch out of the COVID dark tunnel, please remember that we have now collectively all been through community trauma, and please treat people with kindness and treat each other with kindness, because we've all been through this, and it's a very, very unique situation to have an entire nation, many countries in our world who have been through this together. And so just please put a positive foot forward and treat people with kindness, and remember that we've been through trauma. So it's going to be the utmost importance to have that on the top of brain.
Yeah, really good point. And especially when we consider that in the US, we feel that we're on that other side and that we're, looking at how we can do recovery. It's not the same worldwide. And there's a lot of places in the world where it is still at its peak, and it's very scary. And we're in situations where people are not getting as much support as we were blessed to have here in this country. So with that, I want to thank each one of you. I really appreciate you taking the role here to do something improv. I thought this was fun. It was a different kind of a format, and we kind of really thank everybody who was here today. Holy cow, that was really made it very, very interactive. We had almost 700 people just talking at once in one conversation, and that was wonderful. So thank you all. Thank you to Ed Webb for having us back, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day and week. and share this recording with others. Share it broadly. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.